Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2014 Alumnus of the Year lecture at the University of Chicago Divinity School. We are here today for this event, and indeed the school itself is here today due to the foresight, vision, and accompanying financial generosity of the Baptist Theological Union. Formed at the inception of the university, and even before it, the BTU has been throughout the Divinity School's history the centerpiece of its endowment, supporting faculty salaries and student scholarships and providing funding for programs such as this occasion. The Divinity School is a bigger organic entity that goes far beyond current faculty and students. It's a living stream of people who wanted to understand religion better and thought that this university was the place to do it. The University of Chicago alumni are in ministry and in teaching and other positions throughout America and the world, thinking and talking about religion in intelligent, rigorous, critical, and honestly engaged ways. Today, we welcome back to our campus and honor one of our eminent alumni. On an annual basis, the school solicits nominations from alumni for appointment as alumni of the year. Those nominations are then reviewed by the school's Alumni Council, which presents a nomination to the trustees of the Baptist Theological Union. The BTU reviews the council's nomination and selects a graduate whose career reflects, in its judgment, especially positively and in a remarkable way, the values of this institution. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Davíd Carrasco, the Divinity School Alumnus of the Year for 2014. And on the back wall are the plaques of the Alumni of the Year, and we had to start a whole new one for you, David, but your name is now up there, as you'll see at the conclusion of this lecture. Having mentioned both of these bodies, the Baptist Theological Union and the Alumni Council of the Divinity School, which is meeting here today, I'd like to ask those members who are present please to stand as I call your name, and please be recognized and thanked for your service to the university. For the Baptist Theological Union, Larry Greenfield, Chair, Donald Musser, Susan Johnson, John Schlurb, Carol McVetti, Phyllis Tessieri, and Joe Price. Thank you. And I should mention that among those, Greenfield, Musser, Johnson, and Price are also alumni. The Alumni Council, those who are present, please stand and to be recognized. Benjamin Duholm, John Holt, Shania Jha, Ralph Keene, Laura Lieber, Claire Rothschild, and Gary Sparks. I didn't forget anyone, did I? Davíd Carrasco is Neil L. Rudenstine Professor of the Study of Latin America at Harvard University, with appointments in the Divinity School and in the Department of Anthropology, and also an appointment with the Peabody Museum. As he explained so beautifully at the Craft of Teaching seminar today at noon, how these three places intersect in the work of his scholarship. Professor Carrasco holds the BA degree from Western Maryland College in Westminster, Maryland, the MTH, the MA, and the PhD in the History of Religions from the University of Chicago Divinity School, the PhD from 1977. In a career to date spanning multiple publications, I will list just a few, and I fear mispronounce. I will do my best. Hope for me. Quetzalcoatl and the Irony of Empire, Myths and Prophecies in the Aztec Tradition, University of Chicago Press in multiple editions. Waiting for the Dawn, Mircea Eliade in Perspective. The Great Temple of Tenochtitlan, center and periphery in the Aztec world, religions of Mesoamerica, cosmovision and ceremonial centers, Moctezuma's Mexico, visions of the Aztec world, and City of Sacrifice, the Aztec Empire and the role of violence in civilization, and a 3-volume major work of reference which he edited, served as editor-in-chief, of which he served as editor-in-chief, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Mesoamerican Cultures. Professor Carrasco's lecture to us this afternoon is entitled From Axis Mundi to Mapamundi, Great Temples and Sacred Bundles in Aztec Society. Please join me in welcoming Professor Davíd Carrasco back to the University of Chicago Divinity School.
So I want to thank the University of Chicago Divinity School and certainly Margaret Mitchell for this honor of being named Alumnus of the Year 2014. I'm grateful for this opportunity to return to what really is my intellectual alma mater. For it was in this school, within this building, and on this campus that I came to understand that my life's work was going to be oriented by the history of religions, the discipline of the history of religions as it was taught then here in the Divinity School. The teachers who were here at the time saw in me potentials, possibilities I could never have seen in myself. These same teachers made me challenge my own inhibitions. They affirmed my possibilities. And they taught me that I was, as well as the discipline of the history of religions, an unfinished project, always unfinished, but one with great potential for understanding the religious dimensions of human beings. And for that, I'm tremendously grateful to be able to come back and to tell you some of the story of what happened to me after I left the University of Chicago's Divinity School. It's good to see some old friends here. John Holt's here. He won this award and has gone on to do very important work. Ronnie Hartfield is here. Ronnie Hartfield, who spent a lot of her life renewing the city, finding ways to renew the city. It's great to see Wendy Doniger. Wendy Doniger, in my view, has not only kept alive something that was precious and important to me, but took that life in new directions, to new depths, new meanings, and helped us understand not only ways to use the methodologies of the history of religions, anthropology, literature, but also to write beautifully about the religious worlds of other peoples. And I'm very grateful for her continuing work and the way in which she has continued to teach me and my students through her own books. There's other people here. Larry Greenfield's here. We were here together at this school. So it's great to be back once again. So my talk is From Axis Mundi to Mapamundi, Great Temples and Sacred Bundles in Aztec Society. And so what I want to do, in a sense, is talk about two morphologies, two great morphological structures that have engaged me in the time since I left the University of Chicago. One of them, of course, is the notion of the Axis Mundi, the notion of the center of the world, the great center of the world, not only the center of the world in some local communities, but that kind of center of a world that becomes the ceremonial, political, aesthetic, axis of an empire, in this case the Aztec Empire. Here you see an image from one of the map makers for Hernán Cortés. This was made in 1520 as part of the plan of the siege of the city of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. And it clearly shows that in the way in which the Spaniards themselves conceived of the Aztec capital, that it certainly seemed to fit and relate to the notion of an axis mundi, a center of the world. Here's the Valley of Mexico, and here's the Lake of Mexico, the 5 lakes, and they're all organized around a great city on an island. And in this particular presentation, what you have is the gardens, the houses, the zoos, and so forth. But drawn here in an exaggerated size scale is the great ceremonial center, which is downtown Mexico City today, where I'm going to take you in a few minutes. and in the ceremonial center of the great Aztec temple itself, where I'm also going to take you. But it's interesting that here you have in 1520 a map maker preparing for a military siege of this city, also showing that it had, strangely enough, in ways that made our friend Paul Wheatley very happy, causeways coming out of the ceremonial center that divided it into 4 quarters with a great ceremonials axis in the middle. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I became involved in the excavation of the great Aztec temple there, taking some of the teachings that I gathered here at this school into Mexico and what happened as a result of that collaboration. But the second part of the talk really goes to a very different type of morphology, a different type of orientation. This is the great Mappa de Cuauhtinchan that I led in the decipherment of beginning about 8 years ago. Here we see a very different sense of human orientation and movement. And so I'm going to call this the mapamundi, because for the people who painted this in 1540, just 20 years after the Spaniards arrived, telling the great epic of their own journey from the place of origins to the great city in the center of the world to their own community over here on the right side, what you see is an emphasis on human movement. Not a city that itself is the axis, but a city that's a middle place through which people pass, not going back to the home that they came from originally, but they come to this city and move through it and go to a new home elsewhere, which is a rather different way of thinking about movement, spatial orientations, and the symbolism of the center from the way in which I was learning it here some years ago. So what I want to do is give you what I call a historians of religion's journey through Mesoamerica's potent materiality by using 2 kind of methods: existential anthropology, which right now is quite popular at the Harvard Divinity School through the work of Michael Jackson in his book called The Politics of Storytelling, but also the history of religions as I think about it. So I'm really going to be talking first of all about some autobiographical events in my life so that you can understand how I was oriented first, even before I came to this school, and then since that time, where I met certain people along the way who helped me. And I want to do this in 3 ways. First of all, I want to talk about what I call my Aztec moment. You've heard of senior moments where you forget things. This is my Aztec moment where I came to understand something about my own cultural lineage. Secondly, I want to talk about the discovery of the great Aztec temple at the center of the world in downtown Mexico City and how I became involved in the decipherment of that, always working with these Mexican archaeologists. And thirdly, this very exciting project, which I call Uncovering the Mappa de Cuauhtinchan, and especially something that was found in the decipherment of this mappa was the artist's willingness and courage to put in it sacred bundles. And I say that the sacred bundles are important in their presentation in this map because in all of the ethnography that Bernardino de Sahagún did in his many years of interviewing natives and writing down those interviews in his great work called the Florentine Codex, there's only one time where a sacred bundle is mentioned, because it's clear that the elders didn't want to talk about these sacred bundles because they knew the Spaniards were after them. But in this map, in this document, there's 14 sacred bundles, and we see people not only carrying them, but opening them up and using them in certain rituals, indicating that this document was as much an insider document that has come to us as anything else. You know, I'm getting a little dry. I wonder if somebody could bring me some water at some point. I should have taken care of this myself. So let me begin with my Aztec moment. I don't know, let me just find out here. How many of you have been to Mexico City? I'm really glad to hear that, because usually if I put up my hand, very few. If I say how many have been to Paris, it's 5 times as many. So I'm glad that you made it to Mexico City. So here's downtown Mexico City. This is the great Zocalo of Mexico. There's the National Cathedral. Here's the Presidential Palace. And I'm going to tell you what I call my Aztec moment. It really came to me a couple of years ago. I was at a medical conference in Mexico with a number of Mexican American doctors and nurses, and we were having dinner, and one of the women around the table said, "You know, I have an Aztec moment once a week." And everybody said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you know how it is. It's when I become aware that, you know, my identity, my family, my color, my language, my lineage teaches me that I'm not black and I'm not white, that I'm mixed, I'm a mestizo, I'm a mestiza. I'm somebody who comes from a mixture of traditions. It's important for us to say that we have this mixture in us." And she says, "Well, I call this my Aztec moment, where I remember that I am not in one of these categories. I'm something that's emerging in the awareness of people in the United States, and it goes back on one side to the Aztecs, or to indigenous people, because a lot of Mexicans are not Aztec descendants. And I said, that's really good, because I remember my first Aztec moment. I was 13 years old. I was living in Mexico City. My father had been invited by the Confederación Deportiva Mexicana to come to Mexico to train Mexican coaches in preparation for the Olympic Games. And my aunt, Milena, took me for the first time to the National Museum of Archaeology and History, which at that time was not over in Chapultepec Park, where it is now. It was right down the street, called Moneda Street. And here I am, 13 years old. I go into this museum, and I start to see some of this stuff. I see the great calendar stone. Fantastic piece of sculpture, incredibly detailed. I see some of the Maya jade. I see some of the pictorials. I see these masks. I see images of Aztec goddesses. I see incredible stuff in what's called the Aztec Hall. And I begin to, as the afternoon wears on, I begin to have this kind of disturbance inside of me. And I remember that I was really upset about something. And I went out into that Zocalo and I walked around, and what came to me, even at the age of 13, was an interior struggle, because on the one hand, seeing these materials made it clear to me that in the United States, growing up as I did, that I had internalized a lot of shame about my Mexican roots, about my Mexican background. After all, if you wanted to study civilization in those days in this country, in the schools, it was the Greeks, it was the Romans, it was maybe the Egyptians, maybe the Chinese, but Mexicans. In Mesoamerica, that wasn't something that had civilization, had sophistication, had complete complex cosmologies. Oh no, that was something for Moctezuma's revenge, or I remember the Marine song, from the halls of Moctezuma to the shores of Tripoli. It was a place of food, maybe beautiful women, maybe games, but it wasn't a place of sophistication and civilization. And what came to me that afternoon was, man, I feel some shame about this, and yet at the same time there was another competing feeling. And the competing feeling was, no, wait a second, this is really interesting. There's something to study here. There's something to know, that Mexico had some cultural depth. It had monumentality. It had something. I walked back out and I looked around and I began to see, I've not only got the shame, but I'm very curious about this. I'm interested in this. Maybe there's something to be known here. Maybe this is as important as these other civilizations. And in time, of course, I came to understand that this place that I was standing on was built on this place. That in fact, this building right here was built right on top of this building, that this depth and so forth was still pushing through. And that Aztec moment didn't show me that I was an Aztec. It showed me that I had this mixture in me. I had this kind of borderlands in me. I had something that was periphery. Later on, when I studied Victor Turner and he talked about this notion of liminality and marginality, I came to discover that having this marginality, this mixture and so forth in me was not something to be shameful about. It actually gave me a certain perspective, not only on what it was to be a borderlands person, but it gave me a perspective on the people in the center who didn't know what it was like to be on the periphery. And I felt, I got a little epistemological advantage here, especially when I come to a place like the University of Chicago, which was a certain type of powerful center. And now I'm at Harvard, I really feel like I have an advantage on those people, because they think of themselves still in the center. So this came to me at this time, and it really stuck with me. And it stuck with me for a long time. And along the way, I realized some other people had been there and had seen this too, like Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who wrote that during the morning we arrived at a broad causeway in 1520. And we saw so many cities, we were amazed whether the things that we saw were not a dream. Beautiful stone work, many kinds of stone monuments with pictures on them. Of all these wonders, all is overthrown and lost, nothing left standing. And later, when I became friends with Carlos Fuentes, I love this passage where he talks about Mexico City is a city of a fixed sun, a city ancient and light, a witness to all we forget. An old city cradled among birds of omen, that's about a myth, city in the true image of gigantic heaven. This prepared me well for when I came to the Divinity School, but these were things that were waiting to be ignited here. Now, in the background of that, I just want to tell you a little bit about my background, because I don't think many people here know about it. First of all, I grew up partly raised by my grandparents, and my grandfather, my abuelo, came from Mexico in the 1920s. He built a school right on this landscape here. This is the American Smelting and Refining Company on the border between El Paso and Mexico, and he built a school there for Mexicans. for Mexicans to learn the trades. For Mexicans to learn the trades, carpentry, electricians, auto mechanics, cooks, and so forth. And in this school that he built, he taught them and he taught us in the family that education was not only about gaining skills, it was also about social justice. It was a place where we as Mexicans could find an area of, if not common ground, at least it was like a playground where you could maybe get on equal ground to be able to compete and to play. But because of my family, there was always a religious tinge to this. There was always a religious tinge to education and being on the border and being borderland people. And the idea was in Smelter Town, and the book has just been published about Smelter Town, a very good book by a woman. And my grandfather, he's all through it, because of what he did with the community there. But the person that really influenced me was my grandmother Carlota Carranza, who you see here, who was really part Tarahumara. She was born in the Copper Canyon, just at the end of the last century. The Copper Canyon is the biggest canyon in Mexico. It's 5 times as large as the Grand Canyon. And she grew up down there at the bottom of the Grand Canyon in a town called Batopilas. You tell anybody in that area that your family's from Batopilas, they stand up for you, because this was a powerful, tough town to live in. And she comes to the Mexican border, marries my grandfather, has 3 sons, and here she is. And she begins to become a teacher in the family, a teacher of kind of a religious, evangelical person, not evangelical like today, but someone with great religious emotion. And the lesson that she taught me had to do with the fact that she had this beautiful skin. And we as grandchildren were always impressed by how beautiful her skin was, even when she was 75, 80. And one day we asked her, how did you get this beautiful skin? What did you do? She says, I have a secret ingredient. I said, well, what's your secret ingredient? She sort of whispers to us. We all lean forward. She says, oh, my secret ingredient is prayer, 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 and good cosmetics. She said. And, I thought about that for a long time. And in that combination, I began to see kind of a source of my own method years later, because on the one hand, it represented this idea of respect for another, the other, prayer, this kind of religious devotion. But I took out of the cosmetic side sort of technology, the technology, science, and the way in which people represent their own cosmos, their own faces, the faces individually, their cultural faces, and so forth. And I took that with me, this kind of background, these kind of experiences with me, and especially her kind of dual teaching. On the one hand, respect for the other, and respect for people's otherness, but also this idea, well, you got to have your cosmetic, you got to have a method by which to uncover it, to show it, and so forth. And I came to the University of Chicago, and while I was at the University of Chicago in this great place, I really lived the duality. At the one hand, I was at the university. I also spent a lot of time down in Pilsen, too much time down in Pilsen, as a matter of fact, barely survived. And down there, I found there was this place. I was in a movement, and we turned this halfway house set up by the Presbyterian Church. We took it over and we turned it into Casa Aztlan. Casa Aztlan was really interesting to me because that's Aztec. That's the Aztec place of origin. And right down here in Pilsen in Chicago, they got Casa Aztlan, and here's all the murals and so forth that was in it. So it was interesting to me that other Mexicans, other Latinos in this city were also having their Aztec moments in their own ways. And I became very interested in this relationship between Latin America here and also the history of religions as I learned it. And as I learned the history of religions, of course, fundamental to me at that time was Mir Chiliadi's work. And I came here, I really didn't know who Chiliadi was until I came here. I was in the DMN program. I probably couldn't have gotten in here in the PhD program. I had to get in through the side door, the way a lot of us do. Once I was in the DMN program, what happened was I took a course with Frank Reynolds. And I was kind of sleeping in the back until he started talking about the master of the animals. And he started talking about tricksters. And all of a sudden, I began to remember these stories my father told me as a kid growing up. My father told me a whole bunch of stories, living on the Mexican border, with a bunch of other Mexican Americans. And there was always a guy in the group who had 2 names. His name in English was Dusty Hobo. That's what the gringos called him, Dusty Hobo. How stereotypical. But his name in Spanish was Tortulo. Tortulo was the dove that wooed, and so forth. He had these dual names, and my father had told me these stories. And as I was listening in this class and studying trickster tales, I realized that I had an oral tradition in me, that I had been taught an oral tradition about a trickster figure growing up on the Mexican-American border. And there was so many things that in the stories my father told me that certainly fit with the trickster tales that I was reading. The sexuality, the exaggeration, the danger, all of that stuff was in these tales. So I wrote a paper, And I wrote a paper and I presented my own oral tradition. I think the word got around, hey, this guy's an informant. He's not only a student here, he's an informant of some sort. And I was shifted over into the history of religions. But at the same time that I discovered Iliade, I discovered Octavio Paz. My father had given me The Labyrinth of Solitude. I put it in my trunk of my car for a couple of years. I didn't even read it because, my father gave it to me. Who wants to read the book he gives you? And I came here and I realized, as I read these two books, that Octavio Paz, who won the Nobel Prize in Mexico and who was the one who really wrote about Aztec moments in his own way, he had been reading the Iliade. As a matter of fact, if you read The Labyrinth of Solitude, I can show you that he's actually copying the Iliade's stuff and taking it as his own prose in a beautiful way. But there was no question. In fact, they were in Paris at the same time. And toward the end of the book, there's even one footnote for Iliade, one for Levi-Brule, and so forth. And I could see that the great Octavio Paz was reading Mircea. And I discovered this over here in the library, over here in the basement of the library. I was down there reading these two books, and it just came to me. I have some connection to this. And I put these two books together, and I began to see that the myth of the eternal return and patterns had some really important relevance to some of these things that I was concerned about, both as a young scholar and as a person whose ethnicity was up in the air and very confused at the time. And of course, then I met the great Charles Long here. And Charles Long was a person who really turned me on to the myths of creation. And Charles Long was somebody who took some of Iliade's teachings and really put it down back into that kind of borderlands, barrio, ghetto situation that was so much informative of what the Americas were like. I also had the chance to study with this cat, Jonathan Z. Smith. And here he is at the time, with his Map is Not Territory. And I appreciated the fact that Jonathan Z., he was obviously mounting his challenge to the Iliade ontology, and that was all right. That was all right for us because he was showing things that were important for us to know. And even though a lot was made of this later, I was a kind of a student that said, I think that things can be taken from these different scholars and be used in efficient ways. And I went on to try to do that. And what really also turned me toward Mexico again was this man, Pedro Armillas. I was taking a reading course here with Friedrich Katz, the great Friedrich Katz, who wrote this wonderful book on ancient American civilizations and later on Pancho Villa. Friedrich Katz, who grew up in Mexico City, but it really had come from Austria. He was here, and he said, man, you know who's also in the city? Pedro Armillas is here. I said, Pedro Armillas? Because when you read the Mesoamerican and you read stuff about the Aztecs and the Maya, you never found a book by Pedro Armillas, but everybody always went back to this guy. And I said, where is he? He's at the University of Illinois. So I went over to the University of Illinois, and I made myself known. We became friends. He began to tutor me. I used to go up to his house on the north side because there was nobody else at the University of Chicago, certainly not at the Divinity School, who cared very much about Mexico and Mesoamerica. But this guy knew all about it. So I began to put together this kind of synoptic approach, not in terms of the Gospels, but my own synoptic approach with Pedro Armillas. And Pedro Armillas did me a tremendous favor, which you will see the results of in a few minutes. He introduced me to the great Mexican archaeologist, Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, and told him, hey, man, pay attention to this guy. This guy's a Mexican American. He's tall, and he studied with Mircea Eliade out of the Divinity School, and he's interested in your stuff. And that became a tremendous link to me. And so I took this whole notion about orientation that came out of here through mythologies of creation. And when I went and I looked at the Aztec material, I said, man, you got these mythologies of creation. They're not necessarily written down in myths. They are, but they're also on these incredible stones. And when you took a look at these kind of stones, it seemed to me to affirm one of Iliade's points, that coherent metaphysical concepts were in symbols, they were in rites, they were in art, and that these mythologies could be seen to legitimize not only the authorities, the social stratifications, the rulers of societies, but they also had the paradoxical move of sabotaging history, sabotaging suffering. And these two things really interested me in terms of the whole sweep of Mesoamerican history and Mesoamerican society. I wanted to show Carlos Fuentes, who died last year, in front of the Challenger stone, so you can see the size of it. You can get a sense of the, of the coherent metaphysical notions that are in this stone here, because you can imagine the kinds of sculptors that worked on this. What would have happened if they'd made a mistake? Because look at the situation, the detail, and these are series. This is the great creation mythology of the Aztecs right here. So to me, the stuff I was getting from Chicago whether it was Srimaliati or Charles Long or Jonathan Z. Smith. This stuff was tremendously valuable. Other people wanted to demean one side or the other. I said, no, no, no. And when I went to Mexico and I told the Mexican archaeologists about it, they were all neo-Marxists. They ate this stuff up. They read all three of those people. They wanted to know this stuff. They were not Marxists who were afraid of this kind of stuff. And that really opened up doors for me. We also got here this notion that orientation came through finding the center of the world, but here I became very interested and used to have debates with my great teacher, Paul Wheatley, about center and periphery. I felt he put a little bit too much emphasis on the center of the world. I had to pay attention to these cats down here who were in the periphery. This is the founding of the Aztec city, and down here outside of the city is a battle taking place. And I said, there's got to be more center and periphery here in what we do. I just wanted to show you Paul Wheatley, bring him back, because I brought others. People, I don't know if Wendy's even seen this picture. Here he is, was an airman. This is the only picture I could find of Paul Wheatley when he was an airman in World War II. He was actually the navigator of this group. And here he is. And what Wheatley taught me that affirmed that Aztec moment was that Mexico was one of the areas of primary urban generation. And for me, that was crucial. That Mexico, along with Egypt and the Indus Valley and northern China, and these other traditions, these were places where people had come together to compete and cooperate and create social stratifications and monumental architecture and long and distance trade. This to me was fascinating. That in fact, my Aztec moment, I was on to something as a kid. And this really paid off to me when I went to Mexico City in 1978. This is part two, the discovery of the great Aztec temple. 1978, I'm just leaving the University of Chicago. And down there in Mexico City, they make a fantastic discovery. It all comes back into this whole methodological, theoretical world that I've been working on. And you can see it right here. You notice how this road here is curved. Well, the reason it's curved in Mexico City, there's the National Cathedral, is because it's built on top of an Aztec, or the Aztec temple. If you go over one particular block, it's also curved. That's why I want to take you there, so I can show you this. And underneath this particular tarpaulin, what they discover, electrical workers who are laying down lines in the early morning discover something fabulous, but they decide to keep it a secret because they know that if they report it, their work will be interrupted and their pay will be interrupted. But an anonymous phone caller calls up the archaeologist and says, hey man, you better get down to the corner of Guatemala and Seminario Street because they just found something absolutely fabulous down there. They go down there, they begin to excavate that, and what they discover is this. Absolutely one of the great pieces of world architecture, world sculpture. This is the great image of the goddess Coyoshauqui. She's the moon goddess. And she has been dismembered into all these parts in a mythical battle with her brother. Now, what was so fabulous about the discovery of this is that we've known since the 17th century about the mythologies that the Aztecs had about this woman, but no one had ever seen the image of her. So here we are finding this image that Sahagún had collected and had been then taken to Spain and then resurfaced years later about this tremendous goddess. This Aztec goddess who's been dismembered and cut into all these parts with blood coming out of her. And the blood ends in jewels. This is jeweled blood. That means she's a divinity. By her shoes, we know she's a divinity because only divines wear these kinds of shoes. So I'm going down there and I'm like, wow, this is really too much, man. I'm a part of this. And to give you this sense of orientation, here's the National Cathedral right here. Boom. Over here is the presidential palace, and here's where the great temple stood. So since 1300, this area right here has been the central symbolic cultural axis of this country called Mexico. And the excavation that then starts in 1978, still going on today, is taking place here. I've been underneath this cathedral. It all goes underneath this particular cathedral. So what happens is, Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, who you'll see in a minute, he invites me to become part of this because Pedro Armillas had written a letter to him and asked me to take it to Mexico and said, this guy's all right. You can trust this guy. He's one of us. And Armillas had been the teacher of this whole generation of Mexican archaeology. Armillas was a Spaniard who was in the Spanish Civil War, and he was wounded. He was fighting on the good side of the Spanish Civil War, and he was wounded. And he came to Mexico. Mexico was a young artist, but he knew how to make maps. And he was hired by one of Mexico's greatest archaeologists named Alfonso Caso. And Caso is the one who opened up the tombs in Monte Alban. And so this Spaniard who came as a wounded veteran from the Spanish Civil War had become as part of the central generation, the great generation of Mexican archaeologists. And later in Mexico City, he'd gotten into a public dispute with one of Mexico's greatest archaeologists, and as a result was kind of exiled from Mexico. And he ended up over here at the University of Illinois, and he's looking for graduate students, and he finds me, and he writes to Matos and said, let this guy in. So I was invited to become a part of the excavation and the interpretation of the great Aztec temple. And the Mexicans, as I said, they loved the history of religions material. They thought it was absolutely essential for them carrying on the project of interpreting the most important and expensive excavation of a single building in the Americas in the 20th century. And so I was tremendously lucky. How can I be a part of this? I like this particular image because it shows the Mexicans themselves excavating their city. And that was one thing that I mentioned this morning that bothered me. It bothered me when I was studying here, and I felt the same thing from Armias because he affirmed it, that a lot of people in North America who were building their own little careers in anthropology and archaeology on Mexican stuff, man, they left out the Mexicans in their scholarship. And when I got down there, I saw this tremendous work the Mexicans were doing, and I said, look, if we're going to go forward with this in the history of religions at the University of Colorado or at Princeton, these people have to be part of everything we do. Because I saw graduate students here that knew as much as PhDs up here who were building their careers, and not mentioning these people who theoretically and empirically were doing crucial work. So this was really important for me. And central to this, of course, was this great Coyolxauhqui figure, this great goddess. And you see in terms of this notion of dualism that Wendy has talked about, every one of her body parts has a two-headed serpent wound around it. Every one of them has a two-headed serpent wound around it. And it really becomes one of the most powerful images of Aztec deities that we have. Here's an image of the excavation itself, this kind of fisheye view of it. Here's where the Coyolxauhqui was found. What they do is they uncover this great temple, and they find out that it had been rebuilt 7 times, reiterating this idea of an axis. Here you see what happens when the Spaniards came. They blew off the top of it and built their colonial city on it, but we were able to excavate and find so many objects here, emphasizing this idea of an axis mundi, of people really emphasizing the center of the world over and over and over again, and that was important. But really, what really began to change my mind was this fact that they found 140 burial caches all throughout the 7 rebuildings, superimpositions of the great Aztec temple. And when you looked into these things that were all under the floor, you found that a huge percentage of them came from peripheral communities, but even a larger percentage didn't even come from human communities. They came from the oceans. These people were bringing all the elements of their cosmos and putting them into all kinds of different ways of burying, sometimes in boxes, sometimes just laid out, sometimes in cysts. And these objects that were offerings to the gods and ancestors who they believed lived in the temple itself was just an astonishing discovery. Here's one of them where you're looking down into a chamber, and what you find are a number of musical instruments. There's flutes, there's trumpets, there's crocodiles, you have masks from throughout the empire, you have these kind of urns filled with 6,000 pieces of greenstone jade, greenstone for decorations. You found images of masks like this just laid out underneath the surface. And here's Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, the guy who really took me on as a partner in the excavation and the interpretation of the excavation. The other thing we discover in terms of this idea of center and periphery, giving more attention to the periphery, is that you have images like this. And this isn't an Aztec mask. This was a mask that was carved 1,000 years before in Teotihuacan. These people are integrating time as well as other spaces, other civilizations into their place. And what a face it is. Here's an Olmec piece. This was already 2,000 years old when they buried it in the great Aztec temple. So they've got this tremendous sense of bringing things. You had the male god who was firmly seated at the center. He's all over the excavation itself. You have the rain god who's there. You have these wonderful tender pieces of a deer, alabaster, a water symbol, the sun symbol. But this is what really is interesting to me. Take a look at this one offering. This has, it has sawfish in it. It's got 5 golden eagles. It has all of these kinds of images of the male god at the center of the world. It has brain coral. It has layer upon these wonderful masks. It has layer upon layer. What they do when they excavate this, they photograph this, then they draw everything there. They lift that out. They photograph the next layer. They draw everything at that. It goes down and down and down. So what's going on with these Aztecs? They're bringing all of these things from distant communities and then taking some of the stuff from the ocean, the coral, and turn it into these beautiful necklaces, probably worn by a ruler, where you have frogs and fish and so forth. All of this surviving these centuries and centuries of being under Mexico City. So not only was it something that organized imperial and cosmic space, there's where it stood in relation to the Great Temple, but Eduardo Matos is here. I like this because Matos is here. During the time of this excavation, and I had a chance to be a part of a lot of this, every world ruler who came except the Pope came here. Here you see Jimmy Carter, who's here. Jimmy Carter, this was a time when the United States was after Mexican oil. So Jimmy Carter's there, and the discussion, here's Matos, the discussion is, Jimmy Carter says, hey man, how far down did you go? And Matos Moctezuma says, we went down 12 feet. And Jimmy Carter says, why don't you go deeper? And Matos says, because we're afraid we might strike oil. That's why, you know. And Wendy will like this. I had a chance to take Toni Morrison twice to Mexico City. She wanted to see this material. Here she is in Frida Kahlo's garden. I like that picture of Toni. I took her to see the Coyolxauhqui stone. And I told her the story of the Coyolxauhqui stone, this great myth of struggle with moon, brother and sister, moon and sun and so forth. And when she saw this, she looked at it for quite a long time, and then she turned to me and she said, there she is, Miss America. Now, I like that for two reasons. Number one, you can imagine what Toni thinks of Miss America contests. But she's also saying, you know, this is partly where the Americas begin too. Forget this Boston stuff. This is where the Americas begins. It begins here as much as anything else. And just a little treat for you, because he just passed away last. One of the trips I took her down there was to meet Garcia Marquez. She said to me, listen, I want to go to Mexico. I said, I'll take you. She said, I only have one request. What is it? She said, I want to meet Garcia Marquez. I said, oh, well, that's fine. I'll take care of it. But I didn't know Garcia Marquez. But I knew Carlos Fuentes real well. And I said, hey, Carlos, I think she'll come. But he said, don't worry about it. He's my best friend. We'll have dinner in my house. And here they are. A very, very fine moment. And it just gives us a chance to think about Garcia Marquez, who looks like, and Wendy will like this, it looks like he's got a Hindu god coming out of his head there. And he's kind of in love with Toni. I think he's in love with Toni. I think he's in love with Toni. What's that? Like Athena. There it is, yeah. I'll be glad to give you a copy of this picture. So what happened was an expansion of my graduate school model from Axis Mundi to what I call the ceremonial landscape, where I began to look at this in terms of what I call the sensitive grid. It's not so much, it's about the Axis Mundi, but it's about this sensitive grid. If something happens here, it reverberates over here. They want it. Something happens here, obviously it reverberates over here. And the more and more we looked, and I can't go into it now, the study of the ceremonies, we found that many ceremonies start here, but they don't necessarily end here. They may end in the mountains, or ones in the mountains may end over here. And as you begin to trace the ceremonies, the sacrificial ceremonies, you begin to see this tremendously dynamic world between center, periphery, little communities, big communities. Some of the major sacrifices actually took place out here. They may start somewhere here. So I began to look at the organization of space in a somewhat different way. Finally, and I think what's most interesting for you, will be the third part, which was deciphering this Mappa, the Cuauhtinchan, and the sacred bundles that are in it. Now, this is an image of paper. This is our model paper that indigenous people make out of bark from certain trees. And out of that was made this image. This is the great Mappa de Cuauhtinchan. And I'm going to take you through the Mappa de Cuauhtinchan and show you a very different sense of spatial orientation, and also some of the most fabulous images of creation mythology and pilgrimage anywhere in any Mexican document. Again, I was fortunate. I'm at Harvard. I arrive at Harvard. About 2 years later, a man named John Coatsworth, who's the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, comes to me during one of the May meetings. Every May, David Rockefeller comes to Harvard, and he comes with all of his banker cronies. the oligarchy from Latin America. And they come and Harvard shows them off, and they contribute to give more money to Harvard, especially the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. And John Coatsworth comes to me and he says, "Hey man, you ever hear of the Mappa de Cuauhtinchan?" I said, "Yeah, I heard about it because, it disappeared from a museum 30 years ago and nobody knows where it is." He said, "Well, one of David's friends just came to me and said she owns it." And I said, "How could she own it?" He said, "Well, I don't know, but she owns it. And she wants to know if somebody can read it." And I said, "Well, I'm interested." So I go to Mexico City and I go to the house of Ángeles Espinosa Iglesias. And she is the Bancomer family. That's like the Chase Bank of Mexico. And I go to her house, and her house, she's got 3 levels of security. You got to go through people in flak jackets, guys with guns, 2-way mirrors. You get into the house, you go into the house, and there's Monet, Manet, Pissarro on the walls, all these great painters. You realize, man, you see paintings I see in my art history books, and they're in her house. So I'm like, I'm on alert. And she says, "You want to see the map?" I says, "Yeah." So she goes over to this drawer where she keeps, some of her dishes, and she pulls it open, and she brings out this bedspread, because the map is now pasted onto this bedspread. And she takes it into the dining room, and she lays it out for me. She lays this out for me, and I begin to look at this. And I begin to look at this map, and I begin to see some things that are really very exciting for me. And let me just give you a little description so you can look at it, because in order for me to get through this final part of the class, you got to look at this, and I'm going to show you some images several times. Gazing for the first time at the dramatic, colorful, and complex indigenous painting known as the Mappa de Cuauhtinchan leaves viewers with feelings of admiration and mystery. When you learn that this masterpiece of cultural history and religious memory was created by native Mesoamerican artists living in the Altepetl, or community of Cuauhtinchan, the place of the eagle's nest, just 2 decades after the Spanish conquest of central Mexico, the profound historical significance of the document begins to sink in. The viewer's sense of attraction and puzzlement is due in part to the over 700 images and symbols painted on the large mottled bark paper surface, telling of the migration and settlement of Chichimeca ancestors who passed through ritual ordeals, awesome landscapes, a monumental city, and what seemed to be wide open spaces. Upon closer inspection, we know that 3 images in particular are nearly equal in scale and much larger than all the others. It is by focusing for a while on these dramatic landscapes that we begin to gain orientation and access to what might be called a never-ending story of Cuauhtinchan. These images are the dynamic picture of emergence from Chicomostoc and its associated new fire ceremony in the upper left-hand corner. I'm going to show you a close-up this. That's right up here. That's the mountain of origin out of which these ancestors are coming. Now, when I looked at this, what was exciting to me is, you remember, I'm down there in Chicago, in Pilsen, while I'm here, and we set up a place called Casa Aztlán. That is Aztlán, and that's the best image of Aztlán in any of the pre-Columbian or colonial manuscripts. So what they're doing down there, without knowing what Aztlán is or what Chicomostoc is, that's the best image. And I see this in this woman's house, and I'm becoming very excited about this. In the colonial documents from Mexico, there are about 20 documents that refer to this place, and there's a couple of other images. Nothing approaches the beauty and the detail of what you see in this particular case. Secondly, the monumental city of Cholula, just left of the vertical blue line in the center, symbolizing the Atoyac River. So the actual center of this mappa, if you wanted to say that they made all these images with a sense of center, is actually this river. This river is the center, but right next to it is the only city on the map. And this is the city of Cholula. If you want to see a great description of this, read Cortez's letters, because he describes arriving here and saying, this reminded those of us who'd been to Mecca of Mecca. This reminding those of us who'd been to Jerusalem, because this was a pilgrimage center which thousands of people were coming all the time. And here it is in the mappa itself. So it's there in 1300, which is when this map is made, and it's there in 15, and it's there today, still as a pilgrimage center in Mexico. The third image that is larger and stands out to help you get an orientation is the ritual settlement of Cuauhtinchan near the center of the right side of the map. A few words about each will bring the viewer and the readers, this was in the book, is here. So here's Pilgrim's Progress. Here's where they're coming. They're starting over here in this Cave of Origins. You're going to see they're going on this crazy labyrinthine pathway. They come to the city. Once they get to that city, their movement completely changes. They now come and they circumambulate a huge territory of Mexico. Down here's Cholula. That's Veracruz. This is bigger than the state of Illinois that they all know by walking. And they end up here in their new community, which also has 7 caves, which is a replica of that, only now the 7 caves are 7 temples built around the Catholic Church. What's the thing that's interesting about this map? 1540s, these people are clearly part of becoming Catholics. There's not a Spaniard on the map, but there's 2 Catholic churches. It's a very interesting kind of statement. It reminds me about what Toni Morrison says. She says, why should I write about white people, primarily, when what I'm really interested is in the black community? So they're talking about their own, in a sense, their own religiosity and so forth. Now, so let's look at those 3 images just to give you orientation. So here it is. This is the Cave of Origins. This is the sort of digitized image of it. And you've got these 7 caves. These people are carrying sacred bundles on their back, which they open along the way. But they're led by this very powerful big woman who's got more color. She's larger, and she's carrying in her arm the leg of another deity. In this case, she's the winner. In the Coyoshauqui stone, she's the loser. She's the winner. She's got these 4 arrows coming out of her. She's been in a battle, she's won, and she's got the mailed the deity's leg in her hand. We know the deity's name. 2 priests have come from the city, really in 1250. They've come from the city, they arrive here, and here are the 2 priests from the city. They're city boys. You can see they're dressed up, kind of like city boys. They're dressed up nicer. And you have their names here. This is Feather Lip and Serpent Foot. You can't quite see it here. They've arrived to ask these people to come out and fight for the city. The city people have come to the caves because they know the Chichimecas are bad. They know they're tough. And they're saying, come defend our city. We're in a struggle with the Olmeca Xicalanga. And they say, well, we don't understand you. So they pull a bilingual interpreter in. And he's interpreting the language of the city with the language of these people. So bilingualism has been here before Spanglish came along. I want you to know. So here's the bilingual. So this is the dramatic scene at the beginning where you see this kind of arrival, this kind of orientation. There she is. Her name is Itzpapalotl. That means obsidian butterfly. That's obsidian butterfly. And here are the bundles that you're going to see in a minute. Here's the close-up of what's in the middle of the map. They've arrived now at the city. And all of a sudden you have a grid, you have monumental architecture, you have a series of buildings. This is the turquoise house, and inside you can actually see people. You can actually see people here. You can see what the worms have done over time. This is an image that means warfare. A war was fought. This is how they tell you a battle was fought. It's a shield with a B on it, and so forth. And here are the same people who came out of the caves to defend the city, and they're carrying out a ritual, but they're not sacrificing people, although they're sacrifices of people. They're sacrificing a butterfly, they're sacrificing a grasshopper, an eagle, and a serpent as part of the ritual that will carry them beyond the city to then found their own community, not back where they came from, but in a new territory. So this is really what's the second great image in a close-up. And thirdly, here's where they end up. And here you can see the Catholic Church right here, and there's another Catholic church right down here. And they end up here, and here's the hills of Cuauhtincan. But over here, look at all this open space. People don't move through space the way they do. Here's the road of the Great Journey. Then there's all kinds of activity going back and forth here. Here's a close-up of Cuauhtincan. And what's interesting about this, in terms of some of the things that, say, Wendy and I and others have written, when they come, where do they go? Do they go to another cave? Now, it's not 7 caves, but this is the cave of the eagle's nest. And here you see an eagle and a jaguar. Look like they're arguing, they're fighting, they're having an argument here in the cave itself. And the first thing that they do when they arrive is they do a new fire ceremony. Now, when they left the cave, At the beginning, the 7 caves, they did a new fire ceremony. And when they arrive, they do a new fire ceremony. So there is this kind of powerful repetition. And here you see the whole thing. And now let me show you. This is about 3.5 feet high, and it's about 6 feet long. And what I did is I organized 15 scholars, and we worked for 5 years on this map. But because of different political things, basically what we did is we had have the scholars do a very careful digital examination of things in terms of a digital photographic project. Not everybody saw the map. I've seen the map a number of times, and we can talk about where the map is today another moment. So what we learned, and I'll try to run through this quickly, is that this map that we've been able to decipher was painted around 1542. And it stays in this community, and it is used, and nobody knows about it from outside the community as far as we know, until this guy shows up in Mexico. This is Lorenzo Boturini Beneducci. He's an Italian who's very much up into the Catholic life and Catholic Church. He goes to Spain, and he meets one of the descendants of Moctezuma, who's an elite person. She's the Countess of Santibáñez. And they're trying to elevate the position, the fame of the Virgin of Guadalupe in the Catholic Church. And she gives Boturini a lot of money to go to Mexico and try to collect documents that might help in some way with the elevation of the Virgin of Guadalupe. He comes with his wad of dough to Mexico, and he starts going around to different communities in 1745, and he hears about this map in that town, and he goes there and he tries to buy it from them. And what he finds out is that they got 4 maps. 4 different maps. And he does buy a couple of the other maps, which are much inferior maps, but they won't sell him this map. And he writes about it in his diary. He's upset, he's angry, they won't sell it, and he has to move on. So that's the first time we know about this. We don't hear about this map again until 1891, where a mention is made of it in an academic journal in Spain. And the Spaniards are about to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus, so they send some people to that town to try to get it to bring it to the exposition in Madrid. And the elders say, no way, Jose, we're going to let you take this, but they allow them to make a copy. And a guy named Edward Bello comes and he makes this copy, and this copy goes to Madrid, so people know about it over there. But you can see, it's not a bad copy, but it's nothing like this type of artwork. This is the kind of painting. And on the map itself, this person here is about this big. I mean, it's amazing what they've been able to do. So here's a moment where the city boys, there's Featherlip, and here's Serpent Foot, are having some sort of negotiation with the Chichimecas as they're getting across this particular bridge that they've made. And what we did was we looked at other documents, not only the other maps that have survived, but other documents from other neighboring communities that allow us to reconstruct the particular story of this. And we also did this type of careful analysis, and what we discover is that this map is actually a series of pieces of bark paper that have been wetted and then pounded together into one big piece of paper. So there were many pieces of paper that were then bounded together upon which this painting took place. Here it is before conservation, a new fire ceremony. Here's what we were able to recover after a whole series of scientific analysis, including photographic analysis with normal, intensified infrared and ultraviolet lighting, and we were able to recover a lot of information that you couldn't see in regular. Only 3 words are written on the whole map itself: Cuautinchan, Tepeyac, and Tecali. These give us the notion, especially these lines, that this was used in a land dispute in the colonial period. People are fighting for lands, probably in a Spanish court. Before conservation, here's what it looks like. Here's what we could see afterward. This incredible improvement in the information that we could get. So here you see it in its entirety. Here it is in terms of its conservation, digital reconstruction. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about in just a minute is that really puzzled us is why is the left side of the map? For those of you who deal with epics, this is the left side of the map. Take a look at it. This is called the Snake Road. This is their journey. They come out of the place of 7 caves. They have a new fire ceremony. They go back and forth and back and forth. They have all kinds of adventures. They get into arguments. They split up. They get lost. They come back together and they arrive at the city. Once they leave the city, all the movement is completely different. They leave the city up here. Now there's no back and forth. They go down to Oaxaca. They go up to Veracruz. That's a long walk. They come back over. They come back around, and they end up 20 miles from where they started. And now all this territory somehow is represented in a very different way in terms of their relationship with it. So here's the two sides of the map. Here you see just a quick journey. There she is. I want you to show her a close up. Got these powerful women. He's Papalotl, obsidian butterfly, and you can see here she's got this shield which looks like a solar shield, as though she's bringing the sun out of the cave. Here she has got this leg. You know, I like to tell the story that I was studying this about the time that our president at Harvard, you may remember Larry Summers. Larry Summers went around saying things about women, women's mental capacity for science and mathematics, and up to that point, everybody was they were going along with Larry. But after that, they didn't go along with Larry anymore. So I was going to send him this as a Christmas card and say, look, man, this is what happens when you talk about women this way. She got your leg, man, you know. So I'm going to just take, so they go on the journey. I'm going to just show you the journey quickly. They hunt in eagles. It looks like this guy's the first time he's ever eaten corn. He doesn't like it too much. This is a fascinating image. They've surrounded this guy, this eagle, but inside is a man. There's this eagle man. Down here you got this nose, some sort of speech glyph. The earth is speaking. The stones are speaking. One of the things that was really interesting from this photographic analysis, here's a scene. This is the scene up above the eagle's head. They've whited out these two individuals who are carrying some sort of a staff. So clearly they're changing the story, probably because of different interpreters. This scene right here has been eliminated up here. It's been whited out at some point. We begin to see a lot of these kinds of changes in the story. The most powerful sequence is this, what I call crossing cosmic barriers. People fall into the earth in earthquakes. There's floods. They're having a hard time. And then there's this first dramatic scene of a human sacrifice of a woman. And here you see that the chichimecas from the cave and the city boys have joined together to sacrifice this woman. And it's really an image of brutal domination. They've got her bent over a sacrificial rock. He's got his feet on her hair. He's on her feet. The sacrifice is taking place. He's holding up the heart, and what you see is that it's going up to a solar image. It's feeding the sun. But in the next scene, it seems as though the women, they get back, because here you see it as it was in the original, and what we've been able to reconstruct. These women are now carrying, in the very next scene, the heads of some males. And they're carrying them toward a corral where there's the heads of a lot of animals here. And then they're going along, and they open up one of the sacred bundles. One of the sacred bundles is put into a temporary ritual place. And here you begin to see this very public imagery of bundles, which we know the Spaniards were afraid of. One of the best parts of the study was that we had two ethnobotanists look at this, and these ethnobotanists found all kinds of botany on here, all kinds of plant life. And these two ethnobotanists are very much involved in Mexican markets today. And they not only went to the Mappa, and they then went and took photographs of the way the corn is grown today in different Mappa. And you find a great continuity, not only there, but in some of the marketplaces themselves. I love this image. This is an image of a battle, a fight that they're having. They're going along, and these guys are saying, I call it red hot words, saying, hey, ¿sabes qué, man? You know, and they're giving each other even fingers and stuff and all this kind of, and they break up, and one group goes here, and one group goes here. Another sacred bundle is opened. These guys go along. Some people are being punished, it looks like, in a yucca forest. They're being punished with these blades on their way to the city, and the bundles are actually opened in one case. Here you have the bundles that have been opened, and what you've got are these bones. We're not sure what else is in the bundles, but you've got the bundles are absolutely crucial sacrifices to the bundles. In this movement, what I call this is this peripatetic life of this particular imagery. Another example of how amaranth is used, how it's grown then and now, how it's used in markets. You can see it up in the upper right-hand corner, how it's sold in markets. There's the Popocatépetl and Ixtaccíhuatl. And then they come to what I call the middle place. And here's where I'm at this point, and this will be sort of the next to last thing I say. Here's where I'm really beginning to think that we shouldn't put so much emphasis on this idea of the centrifugal power of an axis mundi. But what really impressed me was that there's 14 passageways into the city and out of the city. They all go out of the city. They come into the city and then they leave the city. This is a middle place, not just the theory of the central place. This is a place that is as much a crossroads as it is the center. And it's really shown to be that in the rest of the story, because after they come in and they go on this journey, here's that pyramid today, on top of which is this Christian church of which many pilgrimages still come. Here's the left side of the map, here's the right side of the map. So once they leave that city, they're crossing all over the place. All of a sudden you can walk anywhere. And on that side you only walked on the road. Now you can walk anywhere on the right side of this map. Conquest. I like this particular image because what they're telling you is they're coming along on their journey and they come to a place where people are, it's called Rumor Town. These are the people who had a lot of chisme. This is where people do a lot of rumors. They got the little ears of mice because of ice listening to the walls. So here's where people will talk behind your back, they're telling you. And they go on this journey and they finally, they come to this particular landscape. And this landscape is one of the most interesting landscapes because there's a hunter who's following a deer across a snowfield. Here's the footsteps of the deer. Here's the hunter. He kills the deer, and then he seems to be talking to this woman who's in a cave afterward. But the snowfield itself has these 4 little hillocks, and it's got this tree. This is the tree of paradise. This is the tree of Tamuanchan. This is the tree that you come to, and there's a rattlesnake. And this tree is how you travel between the levels of the universe. You have to come to this tree of Tamuanchan in this case. And then the only event that takes place outside of the road is this marriage ceremony, where 2 women have come down from Cuautinchan, the place of settlement at the end, and they're getting married to these 2 cats from another place called Snake Mountain. You can see the different color of these people. There's sacrifices that are made. There are priests here, and he's using a big trumpet. He's a musical instrument, carrying out the wedding ceremony. It's the only event outside of the road that takes place. And then finally, there is this fascinating image of a temple and a church. And the reason I put this here is because by the time they would have been building these churches, this would have been destroyed. As a matter of fact, this would have been used as rubble for this. Absolutely. But these people in the 1540s seem to be saying, well, actually, we have 2 religions. So we have religions that are really connected, the Catholic Church and the indigenous temple. There's no way that this temple could have stood. It just wouldn't anywhere in Mexico have stood like this. So there you have the map. We did a book. So the people at the University of Chicago want to study it, buy the book. And what we did was we took the work of Keiko Yoneda, who before she ever saw the map, because she was working from old photographs, this marvelous Japanese-Mexican scholar, she went through and in some sort of idiosyncratic way, she divided the map up into these different areas, not because there's any logic to it except in her mind. And then she numbered every hieroglyph on the map. So if you want to study what's going on in F, you just look at F20. And if you're in Chicago, I'm at Harvard, we can say, man, I'm talking about F20. So what we did in the book is we took her model, and here's a page of her model in this darkened area. We did a line drawing, and we did her number system. And then you fold that out, and here's the imagery at the actual size of what it is on the map. So let's say, we want to study this together. We don't have to be in the same, but we can say we know exactly where we're looking. And you have the imagery, you have her line drawing, and you have her number system. So that for all of the 16 sections of the map, we've got what she had done. And so that's my story since I left the University of Chicago. And I'm very grateful to the Chicago and the Divinity School. And I hope you got a sense of how I worked hard to put together what I learned here with opportunities that came my way. And I very much appreciate the chance to come back and do it.
turn up the lights a little bit. I have the privilege on behalf of the entire Divinity School community, both in this room and extended body of over 3,000 alumni, as well as the faculty and students here now, to award Professor Davíd Carrasco the Alumnus of the Year in 2014. We have a tradition in the Divinity School that we always make the plaque completely different depending on who the honoree is. And we have an artist who really loves this work, and part of what she does is we send her a description of the alumna whom we're honoring, and some of their writings, or part of their biographical work. She reads them and creates a plaque just for that person. This citation I'm about to read was written by me, but is, I think, really in many ways a caption to the lecture that you have just heard about the full career of Professor Davíd Carrasco. So I'm going to let Davíd look at it as I read the citation, and then I'll turn around and you can all see it as well. For his field-defining research on Mesoamerican religions and cultures and concepts of sacred space, for his dexterity with an impressive range of source materials and methods in the history of religions, for his many contributions as a teacher, writer, filmmaker, activist, and academic, the Baptist Theological Union names Davíd Carrasco Alumnus of the Year 2014, University of Chicago Divinity School, 24 April 2014. Davíd Carrasco.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.